I was icing the lemon pound cake when I heard him say it. It came drifting in from the dining room. Like any other bit of background chatter. The kind you ignore after years of folding yourself into someone else's rhythm. I was smoothing the final layer of glaze when David's voice, low and unguarded, reached me through the archway. She's basically just a servant who lives here rent-free. The spoon paused mid-air. The glaze clung to the metal edge, trembling in the stillness that followed. His voice was light, dismissive, like he was commenting on the weather, or a mismatched sock. Cooking, cleaning, that's all she's good for anymore, he added with a faint laugh, the kind that signals someone is speaking safely, unchallenged. The silence that followed wasn't from guilt. It was the silence of someone satisfied by their own cleverness. I didn't rush into the room. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. I stood at the kitchen counter, hands now sticky with lemon and sugar, and let the words settle. Not because I didn't understand them, but because I understood them perfectly. They didn't come out of nowhere. They came from weeks, months perhaps, years of erosion. A slow burn of gratitude turning into expectation, then into disdain. Wiped my hands on the towel hanging from the drawer handle. Slowly, carefully, the movements mattered now. My body remembered a time when every meal I cooked earned a thank you, when every extra errand or night rocking a sick grandchild was met with appreciation, not entitlement. That time was gone, buried beneath the ease of what became routine. Then invisible Sarah didn't respond to David's comment. She never did when it came to me. Not since she started calling me Margaret instead of Mom, like we were women in a boardroom negotiating space. I turned back to the cake, sliced a corner piece, and placed it on one of the good china plates, the ones Sarah said were too dated for guests. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried both to the table by the window, sitting where the light hit the lace curtains I'd stitched by hand 2 summers ago. They'd been planning to replace those, too. I sat, took one bite, and then another. The lemon was just tart enough, the glaze smooth and sweet. I made a mental note to use less powdered sugar next time, though I suspected I wouldn't be baking here again. When the last crumb was gone, I stood, smoothed my apron, and walked to my room. It was technically the guest room, though I'd lived in it for 5 years. The closet was barely big enough for 2 seasons' worth of clothes, and the walls still held faint traces of the grandchildren's drawings I used to hang above the desk before Sarah repainted. I opened the dresser and began to fold my things. No dramatic pause. No slammed drawers. Just folded blouses, sweaters, socks tucked neatly into the side pocket of my travel case. I moved like someone who'd done this before. Because I had. The first time I packed a bag for someone else, David, was 7. We were moving out of our old apartment after his father died, and I remember folding his Batman pajamas with trembling hands, wondering how I would keep him fed, clothed, and safe. Now, I was packing for myself, wondering how he had grown into a man who could speak of me as if I were a burden to be managed. On the top shelf of my closet sat a small leather handbag, the clasp slightly tarnished, but still functional. Inside was a business card I'd kept tucked behind my ID. Henry T. Henderson, managing partner, Henderson and Associates. I had met Mr. Henderson at the company barbecue 2 months ago. David had asked me to cater it last minute, and I prepared. Everything grilled chicken with rosemary glaze, garlic mashed potatoes, garden fresh salads, even 2 pies from scratch. Mr. Henderson had eaten 3 helpings, then asked who made the food. When David gestured vaguely toward me, the older man had smiled warmly. "If you ever consider doing this professionally," he said, "call me. I know people who'd pay handsomely for this kind of flavor." I hadn't taken it seriously at the time. I never did when people complimented me that way. I was just the mother. Just the woman who'd learned to stretch groceries across a paycheck, who clipped coupons, who could make a $5 meal feel like Sunday supper. But now, those words floated back like a lifeline. I closed the suitcase, snapped the latches shut, and slid it under the bed. I wasn't leaving tonight, not in haste, not in anger. But the pieces were already moving. I had given David a home, a life, my late husband's entire insurance payout. I had nursed his sick babies, cooked every meal, tended every scraped knee, every broken appliance, every late bill. And now I was just a servant. Let him taste what absence felt like. That evening, I made David's favorite stuffed bell peppers with rice and ground beef, seasoned with the spice blend he once claimed tasted like home. I plated everything beautifully, wiped down the counters, and waited until I heard them coming down the stairs. They didn't thank me when they saw the food. They rarely did anymore. Sarah picked at her salad. David scrolled his phone between bites. I sat at the far end of the table, eating in silence, letting the ticking of the kitchen clock fill the space they left empty. After dinner, I cleared the dishes and cleaned the counters as always. But this time, I wrapped a piece of the lemon pound cake in wax paper and slipped it into my handbag beside Mr. Henderson's card. Tomorrow, I would go into town. I would look at the rental listings tacked to the bulletin board outside the church. I'd call the number on that card. I would see what life looked like on the other side of service. As I turned off the kitchen lights and walked past the dining room, where they still sat laughing now, talking about some office promotion, I didn't feel rage. I felt something else, like a thread had been cut, and I could finally exhale. They had mistaken my presence for permanence. They would learn otherwise soon. The papers were crisp when I signed them, the kind of thick, expensive stock lawyers love to print things on makes. Everything feel more official, more permanent. I remember the way the ink bled ever so slightly into the page when I wrote my name, Margaret Eloise Walsh. I hadn't signed anything that important since my husband's will. 5 years ago, I stood in that office in my navy skirt suit and low heels, holding the life insurance check I'd received just 3 months after we buried Thomas. My hands were steady. My voice didn't shake. I'd come to help David secure his home loan, something he and Sarah couldn't quite manage on their own. It's your future, sweetheart, I said, sliding the check across the desk. Dad would want you to have a stable home for your family. David's face broke into that boyish grin he used to flash when he'd come home from school with a perfect spelling test. He hugged me tight, and for a moment, I let myself believe that the bond we had was stronger than any paperwork. Sarah thanked me. Of course. She was always polite in those early years. She placed a hand gently on my arm and said, "You'll always have a place with us, Margaret." I'd nodded, though something in her tone had already moved the goalposts from family to guest. The house was beautiful. I can't pretend otherwise. 4 bedrooms, open kitchen, high ceilings, all gleaming and staged like something out of a design magazine. They let me choose the backsplash tile. That felt generous at the time. They offered the downstairs guest room. Just until we're settled, Sarah had said. Just until the kids are older. And it made sense. I was already there most days, helping with preschool pickups and making dinner. I moved in fully 2 weeks later. I didn't make a big deal of it, just boxes of clothes, framed photos, my sewing kit, and the Dutch oven I'd used to cook every holiday roast since 1989. There was no lease, no rent, just a mother folding herself into the corners of a home. She helped buy at first. There was warmth in the rhythm of our days. The children were small then, always in motion. Breakfast was chaos, cereal boxes half open, someone crying over a missing sock, someone else needing last-minute cupcakes for school. I was the quiet center in the storm. I knew their preferences by heart. David liked eggs over medium with a splash of hot sauce. Sarah preferred avocado toast with extra lemon. The kids Lucy and Ethan had their own morning rituals. I packed lunches, restocked the fridge, even drove Sarah to work some mornings when her car was in the shop. I didn't mind. I never minded. That's the dangerous part of love, it masks labor as joy. When holidays came, I cooked for 20. I ironed tablecloths and decorated cookies, prepared the turkey with Thomas's old recipe. Even hand-wrote place cards because Sarah liked things to look elevated. I made everything look easy. But the thank yous became fewer with each year. Compliments turned into expectations. Eventually, I became background reliable, invisible. I didn't realize how much I'd given until I started writing it down. It was late one night, 2 years into living with them, and I couldn't sleep. My back ached, my knees throbbed from standing all day, and there was a rawness in my chest I couldn't quite name. So I opened a notebook, the one I used for meal planning and grocery lists, and I began to write. I wrote the date I moved in. I listed every birthday I'd planned, every pediatric appointment I'd taken the children to when Sarah had meetings. I tallied the cost of groceries I'd paid for, the gas money never reimbursed, the new dishwasher I'd quietly replaced. When the old one broke, I wasn't keeping score. I just wanted to see it, to see where I had gone. I flipped back through those pages last night. 5 years of handwritten love, unpaid labor, and diminishing returns. The next morning, Sarah suggested I eat breakfast in the kitchen instead of at the dining table. It's just crowded with the kids' homework stuff, she said, smiling like it was a kindness. And the smell of eggs sometimes lingers in the upholstery. I nodded, even as something quiet inside me shifted. Later that week, I opened the pantry and found a padlock on the upper shelves. Meal prepping, Sarah explained, helps keep things organized. I didn't argue. I just rearranged my spices to fit in a shoebox under the sink. Then the framed photos disappeared. One by one. The wedding portrait of Thomas and me was the first to go, replaced by an abstract painting from Etsy. Then the beach photo of all of us from 5 Christmases ago was swapped out for a minimalist print that said family is everything. I wanted to laugh, but it wouldn't have been the right kind of laugh. David noticed none of this. Or perhaps he did and chose to ignore it. That was always his talent, self-preservation by selective blindness. The last real conversation we had, before things cracked entirely, was a month ago. He'd just returned from work and I had dinner waiting. I mentioned, gently, that Lucy's cough was worsening and perhaps they should consider switching pediatricians. He waved a hand. You worry too much, Mom. It's fine. Just let Sarah handle it. That wasn't what stung. What stung was the next line, spoken as he poured himself a drink. You do enough already. You're basically our full-time help. He said it with a chuckle, like it was a compliment. And I stood there in the hallway, apron still tied, holding Lucy's inhaler in my hand. And I realized something. I was no longer seen as a parent or partner in this household. I was function, not family, and functions were no longer convenient. Are replaced. So here I am now, sitting at the bus stop with my leather handbag beside me, Mr. Henderson's card inside. The lemon pound cake slice wrapped in wax. Paper sits in my lap like a secret. I'm going into town to look at a 1-bedroom near the old library. It's nothing fancy, small porch, rusted gate, but it's mine if I want it. Rent's reasonable, and it has a gas stove. I've already spoken to the landlord. He liked my voice. Said I sounded reliable. I laughed. You have no idea. I returned from the viewing with the lease in hand. The apartment on Sycamore Street wasn't perfect. The carpets were thin. The windows stuck a little when you opened them, and the linoleum in the kitchen bore a faint pattern of old scuff marks. But it had good bones. A west-facing window that caught the last of the light. Enough space for a small bookshelf, my sewing table, and, perhaps, a dining chair or two. More importantly, it had a key that would be mine alone. I didn't mention the viewing to David or Sarah when I got home. They were too busy arguing over weekend plans, whether Lucy's recital conflicted with a work dinner. I let the noise wash over me as I placed the groceries on the counter, pausing only when I noticed something new. A laminated sheet had been magnetized to the refrigerator. Color-coded, bold headings, family guidelines, shared space etiquette. There. It was in plain font rules. For me. No one had mentioned them, but the implications were loud enough. I skimmed it in silence. No laundry before 9 a.m. No use of the upstairs bathroom. Limit time in the kitchen during peak family hours. Dishes. To be done promptly. Quiet hours after 10 p.m. Guests must be approved in advance. I let my fingers hover over the magnet before straightening it. There was no point in reacting. Their intentions had already spoken. They no longer saw me as one of them, but as a potential disruption to be managed. The next change came a few days later, after the children had gone to bed. I was carrying down a basket of folded clothes, freshly washed school uniforms, socks paired carefully, Ethan's favorite t-shirt folded just the way he liked it when I heard Sarah's voice from the living room. I just think boundaries are important. If we're going to move forward with the nursery, we can't tiptoe around Margaret forever. David didn't respond right away. I paused in the stairwell, breath caught. We agreed she wouldn't stay here forever, Sarah continued, her tone measured but firm. It's time. She's comfortable, but that doesn't mean it's healthy. For any of us. David mumbled something I couldn't make out. I backed away before they could hear me. It wasn't just the words. It was the familiarity in Sarah's tone, the way she spoke with the confidence of someone who had already decided how the story ends. That night, I stood at my bedroom window and stared out at the bare garden. I used to plant daffodils there every spring. Lucy once helped me bury a plastic spoon, just to see what would happen. It had been our secret, our joke. Now the beds were overrun with mulch and stone. No spoons, no flowers, no trace. 2 days later, they cleared the mantel. It happened in the early afternoon, while I was out delivering banana bread to a neighbor from church. When I came back, the living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and the shelves were bare. No photographs, no knickknacks, no little ceramic music box that had played Edelweiss when David was sick as a boy. In their place, 3 monochrome canvas prints, abstract shapes in muted tones, like the house itself was trying to forget it ever had a past. I didn't ask. I simply walked upstairs to dust my hands of flour and re-braid my hair. When I came back down, David was on the phone. Sarah was folding napkins into perfect triangles. Neither of them mentioned the change. That evening, during dinner, Sarah smiled across the table and announced, "We're thinking of making some layout changes. Just a bit of rearranging before the baby comes." My fork paused mid-air. "What baby?" I asked, setting it down. David glanced up, startled. "Oh, didn't we tell you? Sarah's pregnant." "No," I said. "You didn't." Sarah reached for her water glass. "Well, it's early. We weren't sure yet. But we've been thinking if this one's a girl, we'd like to turn the downstairs den into a nursery." David smiled. "You'll still have your space, of course." I nodded slowly. The den was adjacent to the guest room, my room. I knew what that meant. Shared walls, crying, chaos, and eventually, a reshuffling that would push me further out, or out entirely. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my plate, cleared it, and washed it under the stream of hot water, while the faint clink of forks and glasses continued behind me. A week later, the Wi-Fi went out in my room. At first, I assumed it was an outage. But when I went upstairs to reset the modem, it wasn't there. The unit had been moved into David's home office. When I asked about it, he barely looked up from his laptop. "We had to move it," he said. "Better reception upstairs." "But now I don't have access," I said. David blinked, as if it hadn't occurred to him. "Oh. Well, I guess we could set up a guest network or something." He never did. Later that day, I saw Sarah slip a key into a small padlock on the garage fridge, the one where I kept baking supplies and frozen meals. "We're meal prepping," she said with a shrug, not meeting my eyes. I wasn't angry. That would have been easier. Anger has sharp edges. This was duller, like water eroding stone. I was being softened out of the picture. I called the landlord of the apartment on Sycamore that evening, told him I'd take it. He asked when I'd move in. "Soon," I said. 2 weeks. I hung up and looked around the guest room. The twin bed, the floral comforter, the photo of Thomas and me still tucked in the mirror's edge. He wore his old army uniform in it. His hand rested on my shoulder like I was something to protect. I touched the frame lightly. "You were right," I whispered. "Sometimes silence isn't grace. It's dismissal." It was a Tuesday afternoon when I heard the truth flat, unvarnished, and colder than any winter draft that had ever slipped through the seams of that house. Had just returned from the farmer's market. A modest tote slung over one arm, filled with butternut squash, cinnamon sticks, and a loaf of rye from the old Polish baker, who always gave me a wink with my change. The day was crisp, the kind that makes your joints ache but your lungs feel clean. I remember that part, because it was the last thing that felt good for the rest of the evening. As I entered through the side door, never the front anymore, I noticed David's car was still in the driveway. That surprised me. Tuesdays were normally late nights for him, some recurring meeting at the firm. I moved quietly down the walkway between the garage and the house, the hedge brushing my coat sleeve as I turned the corner. The garage door was half closed. The light inside was on. I paused when I heard voices. David's low and clipped. Sarah's more pointed, like she was trying not to raise her voice. "No, I'm serious," she was saying. "We just need to make it more uncomfortable. She's not going to leave if she still thinks this is her home. She gave up all legal claim when she handed over that insurance money," David replied. "The house is in my name. We just need to hold the line a little longer." "And what? Keep treating her like some honored guest while she camps out in the guest room forever?" Sarah asked. "I'm done playing nice." There was a pause. Then David muttered, "That servant comment worked." She got quiet after that. A few more nudges and she'd go on her own. No confrontation, no blame. The tote bag slipped slightly on my arm. The bread knocked against my hip. I didn't move. "She still thinks she's part of this family," Sarah said, quieter now. "Like she's earned a permanent seat at the table. She doesn't see that she's in the way." My fingers found the edge of the garage's wooden frame and curled into it. My breath slowed, steady and shallow, like it used to when I had to step between David and a fight in middle school. Back then, I could still protect him. Back then, he looked up when I walked in a room. Now he was planning my erasure like it was a matter of strategy. Like I was inventory. "I'll talk to her," David said. "Soon. Just give it another week. Or 2. She's old, she'll fold." Sarah gave a short laugh. She's not stupid. She's just soft. They moved further into the garage, their voices fading as they rustled through boxes, probably digging through old baby gear. I turned and walked back around the house, quietly, clutching the bag tighter to my side as if it might anchor me. In the kitchen. I placed the bread on the counter, unpacked the squash, and took the cinnamon sticks out of their paper wrap with steady hands. I placed them in the drawer and wiped the counter, not because it was dirty but because I needed a task to finish. Before I unraveled, I didn't say anything that night. Instead, I made squash soup, the kind David used to ask for when he had strep throat in college. The kind I made every autumn because the smell reminded me of Thomas and Sunday afternoons. Roasted the squash with olive oil and paprika. Sautéed onions and garlic. I let the house fill with warmth while they both pretended it hadn't filled with poison earlier. At dinner, Sarah complimented the soup. "This is wonderful," she said lightly. "So comforting." David nodded. "Yeah, brings back memories." I offered a thin smile, folding my napkin neatly into my lap. "I'm glad," I said. "I remember the first time I made this. You couldn't have been more than 11. David smiled down at his bowl, missing the way my eyes stayed fixed on him. I was looking at a stranger who used to be my child. That night, I sat in my room, my bag already half-packed under the bed, and pulled out my old cell phone. It wasn't fancy, but it had a recording feature. I turned it on, scrolled to the voice memo function, and then placed it face down on the dresser. It had never occurred to me to record my family before. That day had changed something fundamental. This wasn't about sentiment anymore. This was about protection. Clarity. I made a plan to keep the phone with me the next few days, just in case. The next afternoon, I found Sarah in the garage again. She was alone this time, on the phone. "She's still here," she said. "I know. But she's getting the message. Quiet. She barely leaves her room now. He'll talk to her soon. The nursery plans are already in motion." A pause. Then, with a tone that almost sounded annoyed, she added, "She's sweet, but she treats the place like it's hers. That's the problem." I turned on the voice recorder and held the phone low in my coat pocket. This time, it wasn't just about what they thought of me. It was about what they planned to do. That night, I didn't cook. I told Sarah I wasn't feeling well. She made a frozen meal for the children and reheated leftovers for herself and David. They didn't ask if I needed anything. I stayed in my room, headphones on, listening to the recording twice. Then I copied it to my old laptop and sent it to a USB drive I kept in my sewing box. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but it felt like an anchor in a storm. A map of the land I now walked, no longer a home, but a terrain of subtle warfare. They thought they were being clever. They didn't know what I was holding now. The confrontation, if you could even call it that, came wrapped in a tea towel and delivered with a smile. That evening I made roast chicken, not for them, but because I needed something to do with my hands. The skin crisped under the broiler, seasoned with salt, lemon zest, and rosemary, clipped from the dying pot on the windowsill. The potatoes were golden, the carrots fork-soft. I set the table the way I always did. Cloth napkins, polished silver, glasses filled 3/4 full. I even lit a little candle in the center, the one Sarah always scoffed at for being too old-fashioned. Dinner was served at 6 sharp. David and Sarah arrived 5 minutes late, laughing about something one of the kids said. They didn't comment on the spread. They didn't ask how my day had been. They just sat down and began eating, the way one boards a train already in motion. Halfway through the meal, Sarah cleared her throat, set her fork down neatly, and folded her hands like she was preparing for a job interview. "Margaret," she. Again, we've been thinking. She always used my full name when she wanted to turn a knife politely. David didn't look up. He kept cutting into his chicken. One bite too large, too fast, as if he could eat through the moment. Sarah continued. With the new baby on the way, and David's work demands increasing, we really need more space and privacy. We think it might be a good time for you to consider finding something that suits your needs better. She smiled as if she were suggesting I look at new drapes, not uproot my life. David added without looking up. You deserve your own space. Mum, something quieter, more comfortable. I placed my knife down. The clink against the plate was soft, but final. I see, I said, folding my napkin slowly and placing it beside my dish. And how much time do I have to find this comfortable, quiet place? Sarah blinked, caught off guard. Oh, we don't want to rush you. Take your time. Of course. Maybe a few weeks? I nodded. 2 should do. David finally looked at me. His face was unreadable, a mask of forced concern poorly covering relief. That's not what we meant. It's just that, I understand, I said quietly. You've both made yourselves clear. I stood up, not quickly, but with the kind of composure that made silence louder. I began clearing my plate. Dinner was delicious, Sarah offered, as if complimenting the roast could smooth over the conversation that had just carved me out of their lives. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The hollowness between us said everything. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the space I'd once made mine. The quilt I'd sewn 2 winters ago lay folded at the foot, its edges fraying where Lucy had picked at it during bedtime stories. On the knitstand sat a photo of Thomas holding David as a toddler, both of them in overalls, both laughing without a care. I reached for the frame, but didn't pick it up. Instead, I turned it face down and began packing. The next day, I called the landlord on Sycamore and confirmed the move-in date. I scheduled a moving service for the following Friday. I withdrew savings from the joint account I kept under my name. A loan and account they didn't know existed. One that Thomas had insisted I keep for emergencies. I think this qualifies, I whispered aloud in the bank's quiet lobby. By the time I returned home, I'd already arranged for mail forwarding, updated my driver's license address online, and placed the first deposit for my new place. The next 10 days I packed with quiet precision. I labeled boxes not for their contents, but for the memories they held. Lucy's first dance shoes, Thomas's watch, Thanksgiving 1998. Every label was a farewell, every taped flap was a closing chapter. I made dinner each night as if nothing had changed. They never asked why I was quieter. They never asked what I was packing. That was their pattern comfort in willful ignorance. They preferred silence they could mold to their liking. 2 nights before I moved out, I left a printed copy of a document in my nightstand drawer. It was a legal agreement signed 5 years earlier, stating that my contribution to the down payment had secured me a 50% co-ownership of the property. David had asked me to sign a memo of understanding, a formality, he'd said. I'd made sure to keep the notarized copy. They had forgotten. I hadn't. Made one more call before bed. Mr. Henderson's voice came on the line. Warm. Professional. Surprised to hear from me. I've thought about your offer, I told him. Still interested in catering? He asked. I think I'm ready. He chuckled. Good. Because we've had 5 potlucks since that barbecue. And everyone still talks about your peach cobbler. I smiled faintly. Let's talk numbers next week. My final morning in that house was quiet. I rose at 5, brewed a pot of coffee, and made eggs over medium, toast buttered edge to edge, and sliced avocado with lemon and cracked pepper, David's favorites. I packed the lunchbox he used in high school, now a bit faded, but still functional. I left it on the counter with a sticky note that read, "For the road. Thought you might need something familiar." Then I wheeled my suitcase through the hallway and out the door. The sun was just breaking, and the house, for once, didn't try to stop me. I didn't cry the morning I left. I thought I might. I thought the final glance around the room where I'd tucked Lucy in after nightmares, where I'd stitched hems and read the same books twice in a night, might break something in me. But it didn't. What I felt instead was a kind of calm knot. Peace, exactly, but steadiness. Like a bridge finally finished after months of careful laying stone. The movers came promptly at 8. Two polite young men with kind eyes and calloused hands who greeted me with quiet efficiency. I offered coffee. They declined. They handled my boxes with care, especially the ones marked fragile in my narrow cursive, and didn't ask any questions when I directed them to the back entrance instead of the front. They didn't need to know why I preferred not to parade my leaving. David was upstairs. Sarah was out walking with the children. I'd planned it this way. I walked room to room one final time, checking behind closet doors, sliding fingers along empty drawers. When I reached the hallway, I paused at the framed mirror beside the coat rack and looked at myself, not searching for flaws or age, but simply to memorize the woman I was in this moment. Not leaving in shame, but in clarity. In the kitchen, I left behind a file folder, plain and unassuming, placed directly in the center of the table. It contained a notarized copy of the deed showing my name right beside David's, and a list of my documented contributions. The original cashier's check from the insurance policy, signed receipts, the co-ownership clause. I left a note on top in my own handwriting. It read, "David, for reference. No further action required, unless you choose to pretend otherwise." Mom, then I placed my keys on top of the folder. The apartment on Sycamore was smaller than the photos, but it had warmth. The walls were soft cream, the carpet worn but clean, and the scent of wood polish hung faintly in the air, like someone had cared about making the place ready for me. The landlord, Mr. Diaz, met me at the door and held it open while the movers unloaded. "Everything in order?" he asked, watching me survey the space. "It's perfect," I said. He nodded. "You let me know if anything feels off. You've got quiet hours here, and nobody shares a wall with you. Not even the upstairs unit, it's got a stair buffer. You'll have peace." Peace. That was the word that had eluded me for years. I nodded, shook his hand, and closed the door gently behind him once he left. The apartment was mine. I spent that first afternoon unpacking slowly. Not because I was tired, though my bones ached from the motion, but because I wanted to place things with intention. The quilt went at the foot of the bed, just like before. The photo of Thomas and David, once turned down in anger, was now placed quietly on the dresser, not as a tribute to David, but as a memory of a time when love hadn't yet soured into transaction. By evening, I'd arranged my books on the shelves, lined the pantry with glass jars of flour and sugar, and pinned a single hook beside the entry for my coat. There was no need for a second. Dinner was quiet, just a bowl of tomato soup and a heel of rye bread, but it tasted like a beginning. I listened to the clock tick. I watched the shadows stretch across the carpet. I breathed in the silence and didn't feel lonely. I felt returned. That night, as I pulled the last of the documents from the bottom of a filing box, I found something I had nearly forgotten. A bank statement addressed jointly to David and me back when we'd opened the property account. It listed a second-line item I hadn't noticed before. A withdrawal made 2 years ago, using my authorization code. One I had never given him permission to use. My name was printed next to the transaction, but the signature wasn't mine. I stared at the paper for a long moment. Not in disbelief, but in recognition. They hadn't just erased me from their lives, they'd used me while doing it. The next morning, I dressed with care. I wore the sharp black coat Thomas had bought me one Christmas, the one I never had reason to wear much. It still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, like the chest I kept it in. My pearl earrings were understated, but deliberate. My hair, swept into the soft white chignon I'd worn on my wedding day, felt like armor. I didn't need to confront them. I wasn't going back for answers. I was going to the county office. The clerk, a brisk woman in her 50s, looked over the documents I brought: deed, copy, bank statement, and the forged transaction. "This is serious," she said, lifting an eyebrow. "You're claiming financial misconduct by a co-owner." "I'm stating it plainly," I replied. "I'm not seeking revenge. Just clarity." She tapped her pen thoughtfully, then nodded. "You'll need to speak with a legal advisor. I can get you a meeting by tomorrow." "That will do." I stepped out of the building just before noon. The sun had risen fully, the light cold but bright. The streets bustled around me, busy with the midweek rhythm of people going somewhere, all in motion, all tangled in their own urgencies. But I felt still and solid. I paused outside a cafe window, watching a pair of young mothers wrangle toddlers into high chairs. One of them laughed, really laughed, at something the other said, her face open and flushed with joy. It reminded me of Sarah once. The Sarah the first met. The one who used to hand me coffee with both hands and ask for parenting advice. That woman no longer existed. Or maybe she never had. It didn't matter now. I turned away from the glass, crossed the street, and began walking home. The first week in my new apartment passed without fanfare. No visits. No messages. No requests for recipes or laundry help. Or birthday cakes. The house I had poured myself into continued on without me, and I let it. Most mornings I rose early, not out of habit anymore, but out of choice. I liked the quiet before the city woke up, the hush between light and sound, where even the creak of the kettle on the stovetop felt like ceremony. I would sit by the window with my tea and watch the sunlight crawl down the far wall, measuring time in angles. There was something reverent about the silence here. Not the silence of dismissal, like in David's home, but of space, of presence. For the first time in years, I didn't have to account for my movements. I didn't have to explain why I was in the kitchen or apologize for using the washer too. Early, I could leave the radio playing jazz at low volume or eat toast in bed. I could open the windows wide and let the wind rush in without worrying about Sarah's allergies. Freedom, I learned, didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it tiptoed in, one unbothered morning at a time. But peace doesn't erase hurt. It only makes it easier to look at. One afternoon, I decided to walk past the old neighborhood. I told myself it was just curiosity, nothing more. I took the long way around, stopping first at the bookstore on Main, where the owner, a soft-spoken man named Hal, had begun setting aside mystery novels for me each week. By the time I reached their street, the sun had started dipping. Golden hour, Lucy used to call it, when the light made everything look kinder than it was. Their house looked the same from the outside. The front bushes trimmed too aggressively, the porch light on despite the daylight. But the yard was different. The daffodils I used to plant every spring had been torn out, replaced with white stones and drought-resistant shrubs. Practical. Cold. I didn't walk up to the door. I stayed across the street and watched as a figure David emerged from the garage carrying a box. He moved differently now, a little slower, shoulders tighter. For a flicker of a second, I wondered if he missed me. if he felt the absence like a gap in a familiar hallway. But I didn't linger on the thought. I turned and walked back towards Sycamore, letting the wind push against my coat. Back at home, I received a letter in the mail, thick, formal, stamped with the county seal. Inside was a summary of my pending co-ownership claim, and a preliminary investigation into the forged signature tied to the bank withdrawal. It felt strange, seeing it all typed up in sterile language, the story of my own slow erasure reduced to paragraphs and legal terms. There was a second letter, too personal, handwritten in the careful cursive I recognized immediately. Dear Mom, we're sorry. We didn't handle things the right way. I didn't realize how much I relied on you until you weren't here. The kids ask about you. Lucy misses your bedtime songs. Sarah's been stressed, and I've been distant. I know I failed you. If you'd be willing to come for dinner sometime, I'd like to talk. No pressure. Just you and me. Love, David. I held the letter in both hands for a long time. Not because I believed it entirely, but because it was the first thing he'd written me in years. But the timing, it couldn't be ignored. The legal notice had gone out the day before. That letter had arrived right behind it. The line between regret and damage control was thin, and David had walked it before. The next morning, I folded the letter and slid it into a folder marked correspondence. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the street. Across the road, a woman was teaching her daughter to ride a bike. Hands braced on the back seat, running behind her, yelling encouragement. The little girl wobbled, tipped, then caught her balance again, laughing as she rode ahead. I smiled to myself. Sometimes the only way to learn to stand up was to fall first hard, ungracefully. I wondered if David was learning that now. I didn't reply to the letter. Instead, I went to my first consultation with the lawyer Mr. Henderson had recommended. Woman named Elise Vance, who greeted me with a firm handshake, and eyes that didn't underestimate me. We sat across from one another in a narrow office with high windows and a ticking clock on the wall. I laid out the deed, the bank statement, the recorded conversation from the garage, my quiet evidence. When I finished, Elise nodded slowly. You've been more than generous, Mrs. Walsh, but generosity doesn't mean forfeiting rights. If you want to proceed, we can make this official. We can request financial restitution, even initiate a property sale if he refuses to cooperate. I'm not interested in retaliation, I said. Just resolution. I want what's mine made clear. Elise smiled. That's a powerful place to begin. That night, I pulled a bottle of red from the kitchen cabinet, one I'd been saving since my last birthday, unopened until now. I poured a single glass, sat down in my reading chair, and placed Thomas's photo on the armrest beside me. Things are shifting, I told him. Not how we imagined, but maybe how they need to. I sipped slowly, letting the warmth settle in my chest. I didn't know what would happen next. Whether David would fight or fold. Whether Sarah would spin another story. But I knew who I was now. Not a guest. Not a helper. Not a ghost in someone else's house. A woman with her own name on the deed was rearranging my files that morning, not out of urgency, but because something in me craved order. The kind of quiet control that comes with putting the pieces of your life where they belong, one folder at a time. Elise had asked me to gather any financial documentation tied to the house. So I sat at my small kitchen table, sun streaming through the lace curtain, and opened the metal lockbox where I kept the things David never thought I noticed. Receipts, deed copies, bank statements with yellowing corners. I moved carefully through them all until my hand brushed a file I hadn't seen in years, plain brown, labeled in my late husband's handwriting. Home equity and insurance. Walsh. It should have been routine. Familiar even. But as I flipped through the pages, something snagged my breath. There it was, an account ledger from the year after Thomas died. It detailed the initial insurance transfer to David, the one I'd approved, so he could secure the mortgage. But several lines below that, in newer ink, was a second list of transfers. Monthly, regular, quiet. Entry was signed by David. Each entry was labeled with a vague description. House maintenance, shared utility offset, MISC, property support. All totaled, it came to more than $18,000. Money taken from a joint fund I hadn't touched in years. Funds I assumed sat dormant until the house sold or someone passed. And then I saw it. A single withdrawal, large enough to make my stomach turn. $12,500. Entry marked Sarah. Legal retainer. Preemptive. Custodial review. Date on the year. Entry was 4 months, before they began locking pantry cabinets and posting house rules on the refrigerator. I froze. Custodial review? The phrase sat on my tongue like acid. They had consulted a lawyer. 4 months before their little speeches about space and privacy, they'd started preparing for something else entirely. A case for my incompetence. Stood slowly and walked to the kitchen sink, letting the water run until it turned warm. I washed my hands, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I felt contaminated by something invisible. Betrayal had a way of seeping through paper like that. I returned to the table and reviewed the rest of the ledger. Additional entries tied to grocery reimbursements, childcare services, coded language for my unpaid labor. In the margins, a note in Sarah's handwriting. Check with family attorney about asset ownership risks. So that was it. This hadn't been spontaneous. Not a slow unraveling of family tensions. It had been calculated, padded with politeness and draped in gratitude until the stage was set to erase me completely. Pressed my fingers to my temples. For a moment I couldn't hear the city traffic outside, only the echo of my own breathing. I remembered Sarah's smile at that last birthday dinner, so sweet, so careful. I remembered the look David gave me when I asked how much time I had to leave. They'd been laying bricks beneath me, building the exit path before I knew I was walking it. I copied every document and placed the originals back in the lockbox. The copies I brought to Elisa's office an hour later. She scanned them silently, her eyes narrowing only once at the word custodial. I've seen this before, she said quietly. Children use these preemptive reviews when they're trying to establish diminished capacity in elderly parents, usually in messy inheritance cases or to seize property. But the house wasn't theirs to seize, I said. Not fully. No, she agreed. And you have a paper trail. What you also have now is evidence of intent. That word struck deep. Intent. Not a misunderstanding. Not a frayed bond. An engineered displacement. What happens next? I asked. She leaned back. We'll start by filing an official notice of breach and financial misuse. Then we can demand accounting for every withdrawal made from the shared property fund. And the legal retainer? If they used your name or your account without consent, we'll pursue restitution. If they plan to paint you as mentally unfit. She paused. Then it becomes a case of attempted legal manipulation. Possibly elder fraud. I swallowed. I had come here expecting to untangle a few numbers. Now I stood at the edge of something bigger, something colder. Back home, I made soup again. Carrot and ginger this time. I didn't have the appetite, but I needed the scent. Something warm. Something simple. I kept the radio low and stirred in silence, listening to the rhythm of the wooden spoon against the pot. The file folder sat on the kitchen counter, corners sharp, contents heavy. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The words were already etched. That night, I went to bed early. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, fingers laced over my chest like I used to when Thomas was alive and the house was quiet, and the world didn't feel so treacherous. Remembered the day David was born, how terrified I'd been to hold. Something so small. How determined I was to protect him from everything, even myself. I never imagined I'd need protection from him in the morning. I got dressed slowly, pulling the black coat from the hook by the door. I fastened each button carefully, pausing at the mirror to smooth the lapels. The pearl earrings glinted in the early light. My hair, still pinned in its usual soft chignon, framed a face that looked more tired than yesterday, but also more certain. I placed the file folder in my handbag, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and stepped out into the chilled spring air. The street was quiet. A single sparrow darted from one wire to another above me, the only witness to my departure. I didn't look back at the apartment. I knew I'd be home by dusk. But where I was going now, the courthouse downtown, wasn't just a step into bureaucracy. It was a reckoning. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Not physically, but in the way institutions often are built on silence and waiting. Everything inside felt beige. The walls, the clerk's desk, the faces of those who'd been there. Too long already. I took a number and sat on the stiff wooden bench along the far wall, my handbag tucked against my side like a shield. I hadn't been in a courtroom building since my husband passed. Back then, I signed papers with shaky hands, everything soaked in grief and rapid change. But now I wasn't here to mourn. I was here to be seen. My name was called just after 10. I stood, smoothed my coat, and walked to the window where a young woman with tired eyes gestured me forward. Elise Varm's client, I said softly, passing the folder across the counter. Property dispute. Elder financial manipulation. The woman flipped the cover open, scanned the documents briefly, then pressed her lips together and nodded. We'll fast-track this for hearing. Your attorney's already registered the initial breach. This submission will support the motion. I signed where she pointed. Slowly, clearly. My name looked steadier in ink than it had in years. She looked up. Would you like a copy? Yes, I said. I want proof. Outside, the wind had picked up. It tangled the hem of my coat and pressed against my spine as I made my way down the courthouse steps. I paused halfway down, gripping the handrail for a moment, not from weakness, but to anchor myself. I watched the street below. Taxis, briefcases, people rushing with coffee cups clutched like lifelines. No one saw me, but I was there, solid, moving forward. Back at the apartment, I laid the stamped copy of my filing on the table and traced the courthouse seal with one fingertip. A piece of paper, yes, but also a new beginning. I folded it gently and placed it in a red folder marked active. Then I made a cup of tea, took a breath, and called David. It rang 5 times. When he answered, his voice was hesitant. Mum? You'll be receiving a formal notice, I said. No preamble. No warmth. I've submitted a financial breach claim and a co-ownership dispute. You'll want to speak to your lawyer. A long silence. I could hear him breathing. Mum, what is this? It's the truth, I said, steady as stone. On paper. You don't have to do this. We can... No, I interrupted. You don't get to rewrite what happened. Not this time. Sarah didn't mean... I know what she meant. And I know what you signed. What you spent. What you planned. You thought I wouldn't look. There was another pause, longer this time. Then, so that's it. We're just enemies now. No, I said. We're consequences now. I hung up. The first letter came the next morning. A formal acknowledgement from their attorney, dressed in polished, over-sympathetic language. Our clients regret any misunderstanding. Did not intend to inflict harm. Seek an amicable resolution, ideally without escalation. I read it once. Then, again. Then set it down without comment. They still thought this was about reconciliation. They hadn't yet understood. I wasn't trying to come back. I was securing the exit they forced. 2 days later, Elise called. We have leverage now, she said. They've offered to settle, but it's wrapped in a non-disclosure clause. They want to buy your silence for $70,000 and remove your name from the deed. And if I decline? They know they can't win a full court battle. Not with that ledger entry and the forged signature. They'll lose the house in a forced sale. But it'll take months, and you'll have to testify. I stared out the window. A squirrel darted across the sidewalk, vanishing into the hedges. Let them stew, I said. We wait. Elise chuckled softly. That's a yes to escalation then. That's a yes to truth. The fallout came in waves. First, the whispers. One of my friends from church called to say Sarah had posted something cryptic on social media. Sometimes family betrays you, even after all you've done for them. Underneath, people had flooded the comments with hearts and platitudes. 1 or 2 had asked outright, "Is this about Margaret?" The post disappeared by morning. Then came the messages. First Sarah, long and pleading, full of flowery regret and subtle blame. We were stressed. The pregnancy. The financial pressure. I should have said something earlier. Then David. Fewer words. Just a question. Do you hate me? I didn't reply. I couldn't. I'd spent too many years softening the truth to protect him. Now the truth had to stand sharp. A week later, I got a call from Mr. Henderson. I heard something about your son's property dispute, he said gently. Word gets around in our circles. I imagine it does. Well, I just wanted to say your catering work at the barbecue. Still the best food we've ever served at a company event. I smiled. That's kind of you. We've got a few high-profile gatherings coming up. If you're open to it, I'd like to contract you directly. I didn't hesitate. I'd be honored. Good, he said. Because I'd rather work with someone who knows how to handle heat on the stove and off. That night, I roasted a chicken just for myself. I filled the apartment with garlic and thyme and lemon. I set the table with a linen napkin, a single plate and a wine glass. I lit the candle I used to save for company. This time, I was the guest of honor. It started with a phone call from the mortgage lender. I was in the middle of peeling apples for a pie I hadn't intended to share with anyone. When the phone rang, one of those formal clipped numbers that always seem to come with paper trails. I answered on the 3rd ring, still holding the paring knife in my hand. Mrs. Walsh? The man asked. This is Daniel with Providence Equity Lending. I'm calling in reference to the co-owned property at 14 Cedar Drive. We have a few discrepancies. We were hoping to clarify. I didn't speak right away. I simply set the knife down gently on the cutting board and wiped my hands on my apron. What kind of discrepancies? I asked. Well, he continued, we recently received a request for refinance on the property. However, the documentation presented by the borrower David Walsh lists sole ownership, which conflicts with the deed on file. Your name is still registered as co-owner. Because I am. There was a pause on the line. That's what. Our records suggest yes. But Mr. Walsh included an affidavit of ownership that doesn't match our filings. And now you're calling to confirm whether I've relinquished my share. That's correct, Mum. Have you? No, I said, and I won't. He cleared his throat. Thank you for confirming. I'll update our notes accordingly. Before you go, I said. Was there a second mortgage listed in his request? There was a pause. Then a quiet yes, ma'am. $85,000. I hung up before I said something I might regret. The audacity didn't surprise me. What stunned me was how far David was willing to go while still pretending to patch things together. Just 2 nights ago, he had left a voicemail soft-spoken, almost embarrassed, asking if I'd consider meeting, just to talk, maybe for coffee, if I wasn't too angry. He hadn't said a word about the refinance attempt. Not one syllable about the financial maneuvering behind my back. Again, I stood at the kitchen counter and finished peeling the apples, slicing them cleanly, precisely, as if each cut could sever the years of enabling. I made the pie crust by hand, the way my mother taught me: cold butter, chilled fingers, never overworked. I worked quietly, deliberately, until the smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the room. By the time the pie was in the oven, I had made my decision. David was no longer trying to mend. He was trying to mask. And I would no longer be complicit in that illusion. The following day, I returned to Elise's office with the refinance call recorded and logged. She didn't flinch when I recounted it. They'll keep testing your boundaries until the paperwork makes it impossible, she said. We need to accelerate. Then let's do it. She leaned forward, her pen already poised. Forced. Sale or full buyout? Whichever hits faster. Elise smiled faintly. That'll be the buyout demand then. We'll file notice today. By the weekend, everything shifted again. The neighbors started calling. Not directly, but through whispers at the bakery, through the man who ran the church food pantry, through Ruthie, the florist's daughter who had once babysat Lucy. They're saying you're suing your own family, one woman said in line. At the counter, not unkindly more curious than critical. I simply nodded. That's what happens when family forgets the difference between love and ownership. By Monday, Sarah's Facebook posts had turned desperate. She wrote of betrayal and heartbreak, how some people will never appreciate what you've done for them, and how she was protecting her children from toxicity. They still hadn't told the truth. But truth has a way of leaking out anyway. On Wednesday, I received an email from Henderson and Associates, HR department. Polite, formal, informing me that a complaint had been filed anonymously regarding a personal conflict of interest involving Mr. Henderson's catering offer to me. Mr. Henderson called me directly 20 minutes later. I'm sorry about that, he said without preamble. It came from inside the office. Sarah still has friends here. She's trying to paint this as favoritism. I exhaled slowly. Do you need to withdraw the offer? On the contrary, he said. We're moving forward. I'd just like to do it quietly for now. Let her burn her own bridge. I agreed. Quiet had always been my strength. That night, I walked to the little park at the edge of Sycamore. It was empty except for a woman walking a Labrador and an older man feeding squirrels with practiced patience. I sat on a bench beneath a bare-limbed tree and watched the light drain from the sky. I didn't cry. I didn't fume. I simply existed. Alone. Whole. They had tried to define me by service, strip me of identity until I was nothing more than a pair of hands in the kitchen. But I had a name on a deed. I had a claim on memory. I had proof. And I would not be erased. The storm came to my doorstep not as thunder, but as knocking. 3 short raps. A pause. Then 2 more soft but unmistakably familiar. I didn't move at first. I stood in the kitchen, dishcloth in hand, listening to the silence that followed. No birdsong. No foot traffic from the street below. Just the steady beat of my own pulse in my ears. The second knock was louder. I dried my hands and walked to the door, smoothing my black coat out of instinct. Through the peephole, David. His eyes were bloodshot. His coat hung open over a wrinkled dress shirt. For the first time in a long while, he looked younger than his years scrambled, like the boy I once had to walk home from school after he'd frozen in the hallway, unable to explain why he'd lied about his math homework. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Mom," he said, exhaling my name like it was too heavy to carry. I stepped aside only halfway. "What do you need?" He blinked at the sharpness in my tone. He wasn't used to boundaries from me. Not real ones. I need to talk," he said. "Not about lawyers or property. There's nothing left outside of that," I said. "You made sure of it." He swallowed, looking down. "I didn't know Sarah filed the second mortgage. Not until the lender called. I didn't answer. I didn't know about the review request either. The custodial thing. That wasn't me." "She wrote it in your handwriting," I replied, calmly. "Your name was on the paperwork." He looked at me then, finally fully. "I didn't read most of it. I just signed. I thought it was paperwork for refinancing. She said we needed to consolidate." "You thought signing your mother's name off her own house was a formality?" His jaw tightened. "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," I said. We stood in silence for a moment. The hallway behind him stretched empty, dimly lit by the bulb flickering above the stairwell. He tried again. "Lucy cried last night. She asked why Grandma disappeared." The words hit like a stone to the sternum, but I didn't flinch. "Didn't disappear," I said. "I was removed." He nodded slowly, as if realizing just how far things had gone. "We didn't mean for this to happen. You did. Maybe not at first. But the moment you heard her say I was just a servant, and said nothing, it started." His voice cracked. "I didn't know how to fix it." "You don't fix people you've used," I said. "You face them." His shoulders dropped, and for the first time in this entire spiral, he looked like he felt the weight of it. All of it. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I'm scared." He wasn't speaking like my son anymore, or even like a man trying to protect his pride. He sounded like someone who knew the ground beneath his feet was no longer steady. Someone who could no longer spin the story to make himself the savior. "I don't know how to tell the kids what we did. I don't know how to explain losing the house. I don't know how to come back from this." "You won't," I said. Not cruelly, just honestly. Not in the way you think. But if you ever want to become someone worth coming back to, you can start by owning what you've done. He looked at the floor. For a moment I saw the man I thought I had raised. The man who used to call me when Lucy had a fever, asking which syrup to use. The boy who used to slip into bed beside me when the world felt too big. "Can I come in?" he asked finally, not as a demand, but a question. A request. I stepped aside. Not because I forgave him, but because I needed to hear the rest. Inside, the air was warm from the oven. The pie sat cooling on the counter. He glanced at it. As if surprised I still baked. We sat at the table. I didn't pour tea. I didn't offer comfort. I waited. "I let Sarah run with it," he said. "She was angry all the time. Said you were meddling. Said she felt judged." "I never judged her," I replied. "I know," he whispered. There was a long silence between us. Then he said something that stuck. I thought if I kept quiet, I'd keep the peace. But all I did was turn into someone who let damage happen. I folded my hands in my lap. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued. "I don't even think I deserve that. But I wanted you to know. I see it now. All of it." I nodded once. That was all I could give. "You'll receive the buyout agreement in a few days," he said quietly. "We're signing everything. Over. The money will be transferred in full. You'll be the sole owner again. And the children? I'll tell them the truth, he said. Not the whole mess, but enough. They'll know we failed you. I stood up then, walked to the pie, cut a clean slice. I placed it on a plate and set it in front of him. You can eat, I said. Then you go. I'll handle the rest. He nodded, and for once he didn't argue. I hadn't set foot inside the house on Cedar Drive since the morning I left. Back then, my exit had been silent and invisible. I'd walked out with no goodbyes, carrying only a suitcase and the weight of not being wanted. But this time, I had the key. The final transfer came through on a Tuesday morning. Elise had called to confirm David, and Sarah had wired the full amount. The house was mine again, free and clear. Not a half share, not a contingent interest. Mine. It felt less like a triumph and more like a stillness settling. I took the bus that afternoon. I wanted to arrive without pretense. Just me and the key nestled in my coat pocket. The ride was slow, winding past blocks of tidy homes and rows of familiar hedges. I watched the city move around me, unchanged, as if it hadn't been holding its breath through months of strained silence and legal filings. When the bus finally hissed to a stop on the corner, I stepped down and turned toward the house. Cedar Drive looked the same manicured lawns, a few early tulips beginning to bloom, but the house had changed. Or maybe I had. The windows, once glowing with the motion of family, now sat dim behind closed blinds. The porch looked stripped down, the planters emptied, the wind chime missing. Only the mailbox remained the same, still slightly crooked, still painted a fading navy. I climbed the steps slowly, not out of hesitation, but reverence. The front door was familiar beneath my palm. I unlocked it with one smooth turn and stepped back inside. The silence met me first. No children's voices, no television humming, no footsteps overhead. Just the soft echo of my own breath bouncing back from half-empty walls. Sarah and David had cleared out most of their things. The living room was stripped of its modern art, the leather sectional gone. In its place, bare floor, sun-dusted air, and a lingering scent of lemon-scented furniture polished. I walked slowly, room by room, letting my hand drift along walls I once wiped clean, counters I once set dinner on. The kitchen was untouched, the cabinets still lined with shelf paper I'd laid years ago, the pantry still creaking at the hinge. I never got around to fixing in the dining room. The chandelier still hung, though one bulb had burned out. I looked at the empty space where the family table once stood and remembered every meal I served there. The birthdays, the silent nights, the Christmas when no one noticed I hadn't taken a seat. I moved on. The hallway to the bedrooms felt narrower. Then I remembered. Or maybe I'd grown wider inside, less accommodating. I paused at the guest room. My old room. The bed was gone, but my dresser remained, shoved to the corner like an afterthought. I stepped inside, ran my fingers along the top. The dust came up easy, like it had been waiting for me. I sat on the edge of the window ledge, looking out into the backyard. The flower beds were overgrown, the garden tools rusting beneath the eaves. But I could see the bones of what once was. The daffodils trying to push their way up through packed soil. The wooden swing Lucy used to call the bird chair, still hanging, crooked but holding. I stayed there a long while, long enough for the house to stop feeling like theirs, long enough for it to breathe me in again. By the time the sun began to tilt, I stood and moved back to the kitchen. I opened the oven, still the same model I'd baked 100 pies in. I ran the faucet to test the water temperature. I opened the cabinet under the sink and found, tucked behind a box of old trash bags, a single Pyrex dish I thought had been thrown out. It still had my handwriting on a strip of masking tape on the lid. Margaret's, do not toss. I smiled. Just a little. Not everything had been erased. I spent the next hour sweeping. Not because it was dirty, but because it made the place feel like mine. Each stroke of the broom was a quiet reclaiming dot after. I stood in the center of the living room. The light was dimmer now, filtered through the blinds in long golden ribbons. I could hear the distant drone of a lawnmower down the block. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and fell silent again. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the deed creased from being folded and refolded. I laid it flat on the countertop. Then I placed the key beside it. The kitchen clock ticked overhead. I hadn't heard it in months, but it still kept time. Steady, honest. The house was empty, but it was no longer hollow. Tomorrow, I would decide whether to sell it, rent it, or give it new purpose. But today I let it stand, unclaimed no more. 2 weeks later, the house was full of motion, but none of it frantic. I hadn't rushed to change the curtains or repaint the walls. I hadn't called a moving van or posted a rental sign. Instead, I moved through each room with intention, letting time make the decisions. Each morning, I returned from Sycamore to Cedar Drive with a box tucked beneath my arm, books, pots, spices. In glass jars, photos wrapped in newspaper. Not in a hurry. No longer afraid of what lingered in the corners. I slept at the apartment, but spent most of my afternoons here, sipping tea in the den, sorting through years of mail I'd once been told not to touch, rereading Lucy's old crayon drawings that had been tossed in a box labeled miscellaneous. There were hearts with guillemets scribbled in shaky handwriting, and paper flowers with glue too old to hold. They smelled like dust and memory. On the 10th day I brought over the quilt. One I'd sewn from Thomas's old flannel shirts. The one Sarah had deemed too sentimental for the guest bed. I draped it over the back of the living room armchair, my armchair, now, and sat there with a book I didn't open, watching the light bend across the hardwood floors. A letter arrived that afternoon, slipped through the brass slot in the door while I was boiling water for tea. It was addressed in David's handwriting. The kind he always used when he was trying to be formal, deliberate loops and wide spacing, as if effort alone could carry meaning. I stared at it for a moment on the floor before picking it up. Inside was a single page. Mum, I've signed the house over. We won't contest anything. We know we lost more than a place to live. I don't expect you to reply. And I know we've said too much and done too little. But I needed to say this plainly. I'm sorry. Not just for what we did, but for who I became while doing it. If there's ever a way to earn back something that isn't forgiveness, maybe just a little trust, I'd like to try. No pressure. No timeline. I'll wait as long as it takes. Love, David. I folded the letter slowly. Not out of indecision, but reverence. I didn't cry. I didn't scoff. Some words weren't for immediate response. Some needed to settle, like bread dough, left in a quiet place until it rose into something useful. Later that evening, I returned to the house with a key in one hand and a grocery bag in the other. I unlocked the door as if I'd never been asked to leave. I moved into the kitchen like muscle memory. I roasted chicken thighs with lemon and garlic, baked potatoes rubbed in sea salt, steamed green beans with slivered almonds. I set the table. For one. As I sat down to eat, the bell rang. I opened the door to find Lucy standing with her backpack crooked on one shoulder, David behind her at a respectful distance. He looked unsure, hesitant to speak first. Lucy grinned. Hi, Grandma. Daddy said you made real food. I glanced at David. He said nothing, just placed a container in my hand, small, neatly packed. I brought your Tupperware back, he said, from before. I looked at it, then at him. She's already eaten, he added, nodding toward Lucy. I didn't bring her for dinner. She just Wanted to say hi. Lucy craned her neck to peek past me. Is the quilt here? The one with the red checkers. I like the way it smells. I nodded and stepped aside. Shoes off, I said quietly, and she beamed, kicking her sneakers to the mat. David didn't follow her in. He stood at the threshold. I won't come in unless you say, he said. I held the door for a moment, undecided, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew it mattered to him that I paused. That grace didn't come without a gate. Then I stepped back. He followed quietly, removing his shoes with a boyish clumsiness that reminded me of his early years. We sat together for 20 minutes. He didn't eat. He didn't argue. He just watched. Lucy on the floor with a book, and asked if the radiator still ticked when it got too hot. I said it did. We both smiled, faint and short-lived, but sincere. When they left, I stood at the door, watching them walk down the steps under the porch light I had replaced just that morning. He didn't ask for anything, and that was the beginning. That night, I sat again in the armchair with the quilt. I held a cup of tea and placed the folded letter in the recipe box tucked beside, Thomas's cornbread card and Lucy's crayon hearts. Tomorrow I'd return the keys to the apartment I no longer needed. A second place to remember who I was.